Maybe we'll learn something. I'll follow, I said. You guys go around to the street. I think they'll try to get out of the alley as quickly as possible. They need to get Skeeve to a doctor, assuming they're rescuers and not kidnappers. Skeeve was still bleeding, as the occasional blood splatter plainly showed. It made tracking easier, at least until the blood trail ended at a closed door. What the hell? I frowned at the door. There was nothing special about it, and the pattern of blood drops didn't seem to indicate any kind of struggle. I tried the door. It was locked and felt solid. Guys, see if you can find the front of the building to the west of my current location, I said. Skeeve and his companions went in there, I think voluntarily, since the blood trail is clean. Got it, Garfield replied. It took about 2 minutes with me standing in the alley looking suspicious as hell. I tried leaning casually against the far wall, but that just made me think of West Side Story, and probably looked even more suspicious, if anyone was watching. At this point, if the administrator had eyes on this whole fiasco, we were definitely blown. I wondered if some version of drones would come swooping in to grab us. "We're here," Bridget said. "It's a hotel. No way to pin anyone down. They could have just gone straight through and out the front door." Shit. This outcome deserved an expletive. We'd lost our first legitimate lead and attracted attention to ourselves at the same time. No question the second group of thugs would remember Super Gar when they recovered their wits. Probably the third group as well. Taking a bullet and just getting angry would look very Terminator-like. Time to bug out? "Let's meet at the third pub," I said. "The Old Gator. Bill, you good?" "Yeah, no prob. I'll be there before you guys. Go the long way around. This snarl-up is still a mess." Garfield took a long pull in his beer. I leaned forward and watched for any streams of liquid pouring out of his chest. He caught the direction of my gaze and snorted, almost losing a mouthful. We'd brought Bill up to date on our adventures. Now I hoisted my own glass as Bill described the traffic jam. It really did sound like someone had just started a fight and it had gotten out of control, exactly like what had happened to me. Definitely anger management issues. It would make for an interesting civilization. The beer was kind of growing on me, unlike the fish soup. I wondered if I should record a batch for Howard. Maybe he could adapt it for humans, or, worst case, we'd just keep it in the Bobaverse. Garfield put his stein down and held out his hand to show a small item. "Flechette. It seems to have the consistency of dried gummy bear. I dipped it in some water and it dissolved a bit. I bet it's some kind of drug." "Unfortunately, our nanites can't do chem analysis." Bridget poked the item with a finger. "But I imagine you're right. Probably a tranquilizer. If they wanted to kill someone, a bullet would be easier. Or a knife." "Where's the gun?" Bill asked. Gar made a small head motion. "In my pack." I took a quick look at it. It has a magazine in the handle that feeds flechettes. This one was mostly empty, and an air cylinder for propulsion. It even looks like it could be pumped up to recharge. It's good tech. "So was that group, administration, do you think?" Bill shook his head. "My money's on the resistance. The tranquilizer gun strikes me as something the administration would be more likely to have. Well, they did have one. I mean, they'd all have them. And the guns would be full. This feels more like one stolen gun." He paused and frowned. "Bob, Skeeve asked you if you were from the Resistance. Did he sound scared?" "About us being Resistance? Not really, no." Bill nodded. "So he was probably with the Resistance in the first place and had been trying to get back in touch with them after his scattering. I think the third group was Resistance and was there to rescue Skeeve, and we got in the way. Whether they thought we were with the locals who were trying to kill him, or maybe that we were administration, they stepped in, jumped us, and rescued him." "But if we were administration, wouldn't we have guns?" True. "So I'm going with thought we were locals." "I still think that hotel wasn't random," Garfield said. "They aren't going to leave a back door open. I bet they had a knock or something." "Do you want to stake it out?" I asked. "We could keep an eye on the place for a while. Maybe Skeeve will show up again." Then we go in and trash the place? Bill asked with a grin. Bridget rolled her eyes. Okay, I know you're not being serious, but it's still worth a reminder that we can't do anything superhuman. She glared at Garfield. Or at least, nothing else superhuman. We want to find out about them, not the other way around. Yeah, I added. The locals might not be able to take us on, but if the administrator gets wind of us, well, they certainly have better tech and probably can throw superior numbers at us. One thing I do not want to do is get captured and disassembled. Garfield nodded. So we can't go in like a SWAT team. That also means we'll have to avoid direct confrontations. You'd think being a bunch of spacefaring computers would have more of an upside. He grinned at us and got some chuckles in reply. We don't have any choice, though, do we? Bridget said. This is the first real lead we've gotten. Even if we're still thrashing around, at least our area of focus is better to find. A lot. Garfield sighed. Also a good point. Okay, I will try to figure out a way to keep an eye on the hotel. Barney's place, Bridget said. Seriously? Barney? She smiled. Almost. The native name sounds very similar. I knew it would be the first thing that came to mind, especially considering the infantile Bob sense of humor. And yet you went straight there, I replied. I think perhaps it's catching. Bridget looked alarmed, and Garfield and Bill started chanting, One of us! One of us! Oh, shut up! Bridget was silent for a moment, thinking. Anyway, if Gar is taking care of the hotel, I guess the rest of us should just go back to looking around. Can we get some kind of search pattern or something? Excellent idea. I'll see if I can get a close scan of the town and ask Hugh to grid it out for us. Bill groomed his fur and thought. Also, if Skeeve was injured, he'd have to go to a doctor or hospital or something. Maybe we can figure out something along those lines? I'll look into that, Bridget said. She gazed at me. Which leaves you, oh fearless leader. I'm going to sit here and drink, I replied, raising my tankard. In your dreams, Beaver Boy, find us a new place to stay a little closer to Barney's. How about that? And tomorrow maybe we can finally locate that library I keep talking about. I grinned back at her. Fearless leader, my furry ass. There were several hotels in the area, this block being Hotel Row. I picked one at random, paid in advance for a week, and collected the key. I didn't like the way the proprietor leered at my money pocket as I meted out the proper coinage. We'd have to make a point of leaving nothing of value in our room. Got us a room, I messaged to the others and attached directions and an image. Great, Bill replied. I've made arrangements with Hugh to get the town scanned. Unfortunately, moving the drone and doing a detailed scan will use up its remaining heat sink capacity, so he'll have to fly it out and bring in a replacement. He's grumbling about setting the project behind schedule. Like there's an actual schedule. I think the Skippies are just OCD. As opposed to the rest of you, Bridget observed. No one chose to reply. The others would be a half hour or so getting home, so I took the time to look around our new digs. This room was somewhat bigger than our previous residences, having just about enough room to swing an actual cat with everyone present. Palatial. The ceiling, as with most buildings, was just open rafters. Of course, the climate was mild, and Quinlan's came with fur, so insulation was not a major consideration. I eyed the rafters until I spotted a good location, not big enough to hide something valuable, therefore unlikely to be of interest to a burglar. I placed my hand in front of my face, palm down, and opened my mouth. A 1-inch roamer marched out onto the back of my hand. If anyone was watching, that would probably give them nightmares for life. I reached up and the roamer climbed from my hand onto the nearest beam, then made its way to the hiding place. The 1-incher was about the smallest model that would have optics suitable for surveillance. Otherwise, I'd have gone with nanites. If someone cased the joint while we were gone, I just wanted to know. I didn't want to scare them half to death. Well, okay, maybe a little bit. Bad Bob. I was considering popping back into Vert while I waited for the others when I received a comm from Bridget.
Bad news, guys. I tracked down Skeeve.
This is bad?
Sorry, Bill. He left. Got to a dock and got patched up. He was gone by the time I got there.
I sighed, but only in person, not over the intercom. Okay, let's meet at our favorite pub. I locked the door to our apartment after leaving instructions with the roamer. The growling guppy was less than 5 minutes away. I got there first and grabbed a table. The barkeep glared at me as I parked my butt, probably remembering our parsimonious spending habits. I couldn't afford to stand out like that, so I signaled him for 4 brewskis and 4 meals du jour. His demeanor changed significantly, and he gave me a thumbs up, which, strangely, meant exactly the same to Quinlan's as it did to me. Some mannerisms, just by chance, correlated. Within a couple of minutes, the others arrived. Garfield made a concerted effort to catch up with me on the beer, and Bridget got way ahead on the meal, which was a sort of pasta stuffed with fish. Because why not? I visualized myself being thoroughly sick of fish long before this was over. I pushed mine toward her as she finished hers off.
You know,
she said between mouthfuls,
one of the big advantages of being a replicant or running a Manny is never worrying about overeating.
She paused to savor a mouthful.
Although I used to love hot fudge sundaes. Then I ate 100 in a row in Vert because I could. I think I'm over them.
I do the same with these fish recipes, I replied, except I think I'm already there. Eventually we finished our meals and I signaled for another round of drinks. Careful, Bob, we don't want to run out of money. Bill gave me a glare. We can't just import more at will. We're good for a while. I'd like to avoid the short-term problem. Over the longer term, I hope we'll have some kind of contact before we run out of cash. Failing that, we will have to fly some more in, or get jobs. Bill grunted but didn't reply. I turned to Bridget. So, Skeeve?
Multiple stab wounds, according to the doc. He wanted to know if we were related. I said yes, but not close. He didn't appear that concerned.
Skeeve probably didn't have any relatives here. He was scattered twice, remember? Garfield made a sort of exploding motion with his hands. Based on context, it looks like some kind of involuntary relocation. Skeeve may be nowhere near where he was born. Huh. I stared into space for a moment, thinking about that. So if someone does something to attract the administrator's attention, they get scattered, relocated, or even a whole town? But why? I guess it depends on the motivations. As in what defines uppity? Like that, yes.
Seems like an odd sort of punishment, Bill said.
If that's what it is, Bridget replied,
maybe the point is just to isolate troublemakers.
An uneasy silence settled over the table as we wrestled with the idea. 1 billion miles of river over which to randomly relocate someone. It made banishment to Australia look like a walk around the block. I looked up as I received a ping from my roamer. Guys, someone's broken into our apartment.
What? How do you know this?
I explained to Bill about the roamer, and he made a gesture of helplessness.
Was that necessary?
If we have to leave in a hurry, you won't be able to get your roamer back.
Yeah, I know.
I stopped as I acquired the roamer's video stream. I expected the proprietor or maybe one of his children or something, not 4 rather ugly-looking individuals with weapons, and they aren't being subtle.
That doesn't sound like a B&E,
Bridget said. No, it looks more like a home invasion, I replied, except no one was home. Garfield swept an eye quickly around the pub. Interestingly, there are at least 2 individuals paying more attention to us than seems reasonable. I think we've been made. My guess would be whatever group messed up Skeeve. And who we then messed up, I replied, and who maybe want to return the favor. I don't see any other reason for them to care one way or another about us.
Unless it's the second group, they are probably not fans either.
I nodded at Bridget's comment and carefully didn't look around the pub. Shall we go? See what happens?
Remember, no superhuman shenanigans,
Bridget said. We rose casually and headed for the door. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that several Quinlans picked that moment to leave also. Maybe coincidence? Probably not. Hey, Gar, are any of those people you noticed now suddenly leaving as well? Yep. I predict interesting times ahead. Do we recognize any of them from yesterday? Garfield was silent for a moment, then said, Yes, I see one individual who was with the third group. Resistance? Wonderful, which meant they might have more of those guns, and very probably had more bodies to throw at us. We exited the pub and turned to head back to our hotel room. I could hear feet behind us as multiple patrons also abandoned the Growling Guppy. Sounds like 4 sets of footsteps, Bill said.
I like those odds,
Bridget replied. We turned a corner, and my spidey sense went into overdrive. The block was deserted. I mean, really deserted. In the middle of the day. As we continued on our path, the footsteps behind us came around the corner, and at that moment, another 4 Quinlans stepped out of doorways ahead of us. Wonderful, classic encircling maneuver, Bill said. And masterfully executed, Garfield replied. My compliments to the resistance. And 2-to-1 odds are still Oh, shit. I was swearing a lot lately, but it seemed appropriate. The group surrounding us had just pulled knives. Big knives. Real metal from the look of them. I think we're probably going to have to push the limits of what's possible for a Quinlan to get out of this one. Try not to cast fireballs, but almost anything else is fair game. The thugs took their time forming a circle. They grinned at us and waved their knives in a menacing manner. I wasn't sure if they were just trying for psychological advantage or wanted us to beg for our lives. Either way, they were going to be disappointed. They attacked simultaneously, jumping toward us more or less as a unit. I was impressed, despite myself. They either drilled together regularly or they'd practiced this particular maneuver. Unfortunately, they weren't dealing with real Quinlans. I slid to the outside of the nearest knife thrust, grabbed the arm, and rotated my body. My target spun around me and smacked headlong into the Quinlan beside him, but without his knife, which I'd appropriated during the maneuver. As the second attacker staggered under the impact, I smacked him on the side of the head. Punching didn't look like it would be a good idea with the Quinlans, more likely to break their haora without knocking them out, and I didn't want to do that kind of possibly permanent damage. Number 2 went down as number 1 caught his balance and turned to me. A second smack and he was down. I spun around to see how my teammates were doing. Bill and Gar had used similar tactics since we'd all taken the same self-defense courses. Bridget, however, didn't have any particular martial arts training, at least based on her fighting style, which depended mostly on enthusiasm. She finished off her 2 attackers, then turned to glare at us. What was that? Garfield said. Cage match, foo?
They're down, aren't they?
She replied, concentrating her glare on him. Garfield reached down and gathered the last 2 knives. I think we may have a solution to our money problem. Bet these are worth mucho bucks. But not here. Pretty sure our welcome has just worn out in Galen. They're after us. They don't appear to be interested in talking, and I bet they'll just keep throwing more and more bodies at us. Great, I said. I sent a silent command to my roamer to zero in on me. Time for a swim, I guess. I opened my mouth and the roamer crawled in. Garfield groaned and cringed, and I laughed. Yep, ate a bug.
I bet you had that in mind when you designed these things, Bridget said with a head shake. Children.
Still not mature, even after 300 years, I said, grinning in reply. Okay, fun's fun. Time to go. Bill reinforced the statement by diving into the water without waiting. This was a little more work than normal because we weren't leaving from the dock. It had occurred to us that it would be an easy location to establish surveillance, if there were more than the 8 thugs. With that in mind, we'd circled around to the west side of town and then simply walked away until we found an isolated beach. We dove in after Bill, skillfully avoiding the shallow bottom, and torpedoed out to mid-river where the current was swiftest. It took only a moment to link up into a Quinlan raft.
Well, that was eventful, Bridget said. We do seem to make a splash in every town.
We's rock stars, we is, Garfield muttered.
And we still haven't hit that library,
Bridget reminded us. Okay, next town we do that first thing. We should also think about trying to find the resistance. Maybe not to talk, maybe to spy on. If Skeeve was able to get in touch with them despite being in a new town, they must be either easy to locate or have lots of ears. Yeah, talking isn't proving to be a high probability strategy, honestly, Bill replied. We'll try spying first.
Sounds good, Bridget said. Funny, despite my initial skepticism about Hugh's statistics, it looks like he was right. 2 towns in, we've contacted a group that might either know something or can point us at someone.
Garfield snickered. Yeah, contacted. Say, which one of us has a hole in his sternum? Bill grinned at him. Way to take one for the team. We settled into a companionable silence as the sun warmed our top halves. Insects buzzed around us and Bridget swatted at one.
Must be a heat seeker. Interesting. I'm impressed at how robust the artificial ecosystem is.
I looked around. The Arcadia River's pretty wide here and the current is slow. Let's hand off to the AMIs. They can alert us if anything requires our attention. The others made agreeing sounds, and we popped back into Vert. 23. Dancing with Dragons. Bill, July 2334. Vert. 2 gamers lay dead, their smoking, ruined skeletons providing perfect tripping hazards as players ran frantically back and forth. The dragon, red variety, was doing its best to immolate the rest of the dungeon party. The only thing working in our favor was that the beast seemed to want to get at least 2 targets with each flame breath. Given the required recharge time, it was a reasonable tactic. "Get under him! Hit him in the belly!" Tim the warrior yelled. "You first, asshole!" replied Vern the dwarf warlord. "You're the one with the magic sword." The dragon, an NPC known as Garg the Destroyer, roared and tried to stomp on Tim. Also a reasonable tactic. Tim was far too close to take out with fire breath, at least not without dealing itself a few hit points of damage. I had, for the moment, escaped Garg's attention, probably because I was A, by myself, and B, flat on my back, having been run over by our NPC troops when they fled in terror. I had only some crap armor and a basic sword to my name. The gamers had flat out refused to give me a higher starting level. Something about game integrity. Sure. The smoking remains of Kevin the Wise, perhaps not as wise as he thought, still had a death grip on his former pride and joy, a staff of fireballs. Unfortunately, a staff of fireballs against a red dragon was about as useful as a harshly worded email. Now, if he'd had a staff of ice storms or something. Still, it was a valuable weapon. If I got out of this alive, it might be tradable for some enchanted armor or something. I stood, grabbed the staff, and wrenched it out of what was left of Kevin's hand. "Christ's sake, Bill, get in the game!" Vern yelled. "That thing's useless against a red dragon." Garg screamed in rage and pain as one of the players managed to cut a chunk off the dragon's leg. In response, Garg temporarily abandoned his 2 targets per breath policy and gave the player, Tim, I think, the full treatment. From that range, even bones would be unlikely to survive. Tim yelled, "Aw, shit!" as he turned to ash. Garg then went after Vern the old-fashioned way, attempting to eat him. Vern skipped back, desperately waving his battle axe. Interesting thing about dragon physiology, though, when they leaned down to bite someone, the tail went up as a counterbalance. And I discovered, from my vantage point, that the gamers had been obsessively thorough about anatomical details. I wondered for a moment if I should be watching for dragon poop. Come to think of it, though, a red dragon was probably no more flame-proof on the inside than any other animal. With that thought, I ran up behind the dragon. As a first-level grunt, I was barely worth paying attention to. Jammed the staff of fireballs right where a rectal thermometer would go, and pulled the trigger. There was a muffled whump sound. The dragon turned with a surprised look, and smoke puffed out of its ears. Then it screeched, leaped straight up, and the entire scene froze. A voice said out of thin air, "Okay, we'll need a ruling here. Is the target entitled to a saving throw?" "Are you friggin' kidding me?" Vern screamed. "How in the hell is it supposed to dodge that?" Vern and the disembodied voice began to yell insults at each other, with Vern capering around and waving his fists in the air as counterpoint. The rest of us gathered around Garg, still frozen in mid-leap, the staff right where I'd left it.
"Fried dragon on a stick,"
Pete said, slapping me on the shoulder.
"Nice. You'll get full credit for that kill."
We'd shut down the dungeon and were relaxing in the locker room comparing notes. I wasn't sure why there was a locker room, but I figured if I could have a pub, they could have a locker room.
"They're still arguing," Gandalf said, shaking his head. "Man, you really created a shitstorm." He chuckled. "Sorry, bad choice of words."
I grinned at the rest of the dungeon party. Kevin, whose staff of fireballs was now mine, glared sullenly, then averted his eyes. Not a fan, I guess. I was going to get the entire score for the dragon unless the dissenters managed to overturn the decision and half the dragon's horde. The combined experience points would boost me 3 levels easily, plus whatever I could get for the staff. Pretty good day overall. If only real life went that way. I motioned to Gandalf with my chin. We should really get on with things. He nodded and popped us both into his private VR, which closely resembled Orthanc from the Peter Jackson movies, but with lazy boy couches.
"So, what's your concern, Bill?"
"Honestly, Gandalf, you guys seem to have bailed on the project before you finished." He frowned.
"Interesting. Maybe we have different definitions of finished? Certainly the expedition has a long way to go, but I think we've done what we set out to do."
Ecological and sociological surveys aren't complete. Language translation is mostly there, but still has some holes. We haven't even made a dent in mapping the Topopolis, not to mention surveys of Quinn. Gandalf gave me a look of exaggerated patience.
"A lot of that is Skippy responsibility. We've been helping, but only because it was interesting for a while."
"Come on, Bill, what part of volunteer aren't you grokking? So as soon as it becomes less interesting, you bail?" Gandalf thought for a moment.
"Yep, pretty much." He hesitated for a moment. "Look, we're still available for specific questions, but as far as further research is concerned, I think we're tapping out. Bring us another interesting puzzle, though, and we can talk. Okay?"
I sighed. Less and less Bob. "Fine, I got it." I stood up. "Put my character on reserves, okay? I'll probably be back." He grinned and gave me a thumbs up as I popped out. 24. Interlude. Bob, July 2334, Vert. Hugh sat in a beanbag chair, nursing a coffee and staring into space. I'd forwarded our logs for the last few days, and he'd immediately invited himself over. "Tranquilizer guns, huh?" He took a sip. "Interesting choice of weapon." "How so?" "There's so many easier and less complex ways of taking out an opponent, starting with stabbing them and working up to a proper pistol with bullets. Heaven's River isn't a space station. You wouldn't have to worry about making a hole. The shell material wouldn't even notice a bullet up to a considerably larger caliber." "Okay, anything we can learn from that?" "Assuming the gun was stolen, which is reasonable, the administrator seems to want to be careful not to kill anyone." Hugh was silent for several moments more. "And the scattering?" "I think you're right about the interpretation. Again, it would be easier to just kill people." "Is it significant?" Hugh opened his mouth several times to speak, then got a funny look. "Not sure. It could just be that Quinlans don't like killing each other. Except, Quinn, the planet. Listen, Bob, you still have that spare Manny buried near the transit station. Have you thought about activating it and sending someone off, maybe upstream?" I shook my head. No, it's a spare, Hugh. In case we total one of ours, we need to stay a foursome. Too bad. I'd like to be able to try one out. There's still the test units on Quinn. I understand Will and Howard have been playing around with them. And breaking them, apparently, Hugh replied. Then, at the look on my face, he added, "Oh, you didn't know. Don't let Bridget find out. Howard broke one?" Hugh's only reply was a grin. He put down his coffee cup and stood. I got the scan done of Galentown. Nothing unusual. Right down to the limits of resolution that I had time for. In particular, no electronics or forbidden tech that I could find. Which might mean the Resistance doesn't have it, or might mean they don't keep it in town. What about the tranq guns? Hugh shrugged. They don't register as electronics, so I'd have to specifically scan for them. And I just didn't have time before the heatsink burned out. And for that same reason, random scanning is a non-starter. I had to retire a drone to get what I did, and I'll be short-handed until I can fly in a replacement. He held up a hand. Talk later, and popped out. On a whim, since I had some time to spare, I decided to visit Will on Valhalla. Our last meeting had ended abruptly. As soon as I received an acknowledgement, I popped over. It took only a second to unrack my Manny, and I glanced around. Instead of Will sitting in a chair, I found a 2-foot roamer waving a leg at me. The roamer began walking, then paused, significantly. Presumably it was giving me an impatient look or something, but because the devices were symmetrical, it was really hard to tell. The roamers hadn't changed that much in the 200 years since they'd been invented, at least not in principle. Lots of improvements had been made, like the Casimir power source, better materials, more compact electronics, and so on, but it was still an 8-legged general-purpose robot run by a moronic machine intelligence. I frowned in thought as I followed the device. Maybe the Skippies had the right idea. The creation of a practical AI, whether it was truly conscious or just zombie-level capable, would have a huge impact on society. Maybe even more than subspace theory and the accompanying technologies had. The roamer led me out of Will's home and down a long sequence of staircases, some constructed and some cut right out of the native stone. I was beginning to wonder if I'd misunderstood the roamer when we finally came to a flat area on the south side of the promontory on which Will's home was built. Will stood and waved to me as the roamer did an about-face and headed back to the house. With no need to allow for humanoid limitations on the return trip, the roamer was going straight up the rock face. Show off. Hey, Will, what have you got here? Will smiled and motioned to the miscellany of potted plants and plants in earthen rows. Experimental garden. I've got Terran plants and native plants here, and I'm testing for compatibility. We don't want any surprises when we start full-on agriculture. I nodded slowly. It's interesting that original Bob wasn't much of a gardener, but both you and Bill have turned into real plant specialists. Terraforming puts a whole nother spin on the problem, bud. Will motioned toward a set of Adirondack chairs near the edge of the garden area. I sat and took a moment to admire the view. Will had picked a location for his home that overlooked a huge lake, surrounded by low mountains. The tree line, or whatever it was, only extended about halfway up the distant slopes, probably due to the still-too-thin atmosphere. Will followed my gaze and guessed the direction of my thoughts. The tree line is moving up the slope by several feet per year right now, and it's accelerating. By the time it stabilizes, you'll be able to see plant life all the way to the top of these mountains. And by that point, humans will be living here without having to wear supplemental masks or live under a dome. We were silent for a few seconds while I admired the scenery. Will seemed to be content with whatever pace I set. Finally, I turned to him. Last time I was here, we were talking about Starfleet. Mostly, but there's Starfleet, the Borg, the Gamers, the Skippies, and those are just the ones that have nicknames, Will replied. The Bobiverse is going in a lot of different directions, Bob, literally and metaphorically. A lot of replicants have finally decided to take the von Neumann probe job description seriously. For instance, we've actually got a couple of thousand Bobs that are actively heading away from human space. Some are stopping and building stations. Some are just accelerating. Yeah, I examined my hands. It's just that I have a bad feeling. The Bobiverse was a post-scarcity society for a while, and a utopia, at least for most of us. Well, what happens to a post-scarcity society when part of the society wants power over the rest of that society? I think you end up either a dystopia or with two societies, and the transition may or may not be orderly and peaceful. Will sighed. I haven't got an answer for you, bud. We're just going to have to wait and see how far Starfleet is willing to push. I sat back and crossed my arms, glaring at the scenery without seeing it. It appeared utopia was an unstable state. 25. Trouble follows. Bob. July 2334, Elbow. Another day, another town. Touring with a band could be so boring. According to Garfield, anyway. He seemed to be on a rock star metaphor for some reason. We'd floated for a full day and eventually arrived at the town of Elbow. Yeah. Elbow. Didn't seem to be short for anything either. It was situated at a bend in the river, though, so maybe that? We pulled our dripping butts up onto the dock, shook off. Quinlan's did something very similar to dogs to shed water, and moseyed into town. Elbow seemed to be larger than average, with a robust performing arts subculture. Or maybe there was a festival on. It seemed like every third person was either carrying a musical instrument or dressed up like a minstrel. Or maybe a clown. It could be hard to tell. We saw at least 2 stages with people performing on them, and one children's theater with a Muppets kind of a thing going on. No Kermit, that would have been freaky, but the lead character did have a Fozzie-ish kind of look. I stopped to watch and got an elbow in the ribs from Bridget. Grumbling, I rejoined the group. Bridget buttonholed a couple of people and asked about a library. The second individual gave us an unnerving once-over before responding with directions. That was odd, Bill said as we continued on. Are we underdressed or something? I looked down at my naked save-for-fur body. I grinned at the answering chuckle. But I'm glad it's not just me that thought he was odd. We weren't in any particular hurry now that Bridget had her goal in sight, so to speak, so we were able to stop and watch the shows. I asked a few questions and confirmed that there was, in fact, an annual festival going on, something local, and I never got the gist of the reason for the celebration, but any reason for a party is a good reason. The singing was surprisingly good. For all their resemblance to members of the weasel and rodent families, Quinlan's had amazingly good voices and understood harmony. As for their dancing, the less said, the better. When your legs are that short, you can't really soar. I tried to be cosmopolitan and open-minded and appreciate the effort. No, that was just a bridge too far. Eventually, the festivities petered out as we moved from the entertainment district into what I assumed must be the business district. And a quite deserted district at that, since everyone was probably back at the party. Say, guys, Garfield said as we turned a corner. I'm looking down that block, he pointed, and we've been there. I just did a mapping in my head, and that guy gave us really long way around directions. My spidey sense is jumping up and down and waving its arms right now. I turned, and sure enough, that was a familiar traffic island. My own spidey sense started dancing a Quinlan ballet in time to Garfield's. I turned around slowly, scanning the entire area. Bill? Bridget?
Nothing, and we're about 2 blocks away from the library, Bridget said. Maybe he only knew the one way to get there, or maybe he wanted us to see the sights. Look, I appreciate your concern, but it's closer to the library than the river, so...
Right, I replied. But let's keep our guard up until we get there. We continued on our route, but without any of the previous sightseeing activity. Every sense was tuned, every reflex on hair trigger. If someone had innocently popped out of a doorway at that point, they might have met an unfortunate end. Bridget halted abruptly, and Bill almost walked into her.
What do you guys always call it? Spidey sense?
She motioned to the square ahead of us where an ornately official building sported a large sign that translated as Sanctuary of the Written Word. What is it, Bridge? There were a couple of people talking outside the door of the library, but I couldn't see anything else.
I'm not sure. One of those guys there started to turn toward us, then aborted the move with a jerk, like someone who'd just been told, "Don't look, you idiot."
We stood in one spot for several seconds, indecisive. Then Bill said, "So let's see what happens if we try to leave." With that, he wheeled and strode off. The rest of us looked at each other briefly, then turned and followed him. And all hell broke loose. There was a shout behind us, followed immediately by an answering call. Out of doorways and alleys, more than a dozen Quinlans emerged at full gallop. And I do mean gallop. They were on all fours, a much quicker mode of travel. And they were carrying swords in their mouths, pirate style. Uh-oh, I don't think this is the welcome wagon. Time to be elsewhere.
Thanks, Bob, for that insightful analysis, Bridget said. Now move your ass or get out of my way.
Without waiting for me to make up my mind, she shot past me, heading for the dock. The direct way, too. Apparently, she'd checked Garfield's map. And, no surprise, the welcome wagon had thought we might do that. 6 more Quinlans appeared in front of us, sporting either very large knives or short swords. I wasn't inclined to stop and take a measurement, and 3 of them had what appeared to be holstered pistols. Trank guns? I jacked slightly. Not enough to lose connection with the Manny, but enough to have time for a conversation. The others synced automatically. How many?
I saw 6 in front and 12 behind. Some of the ones in front have trank guns.
14 behind, Garfield said, correcting Bridget's assessment. Big gap to the left. We could make for that. This is a well-planned hit, Bob. They left a big gap to a whole street by accident? I don't think so. Bill was right. Good point. Let's not go that way. We're not going to go through them. Not with those pig stickers, Garfield said.
It may be time to loosen up on the no impossible moves rule. I don't want to end up as sushi.
For Bridget, that was a significant concession. Or gift-wrapped. Agreed, Bill added. Let's go through the 6 in front, full gonzo. I received 3 acts and shifted my Manny into overdrive. Not that it turned into a transformer or anything, but the internal power supply jacked up the full output. All internal nanites deployed for possible damage, and fake blood circulation was increased to handle the higher cooling requirements. There would need to be some maintenance done later. The scene slowed in my visual field, and I took the time to estimate angles and distances. Garfield and Bridget had already picked lines that would take them either around or through the defensive ends, so I was going to have to go through the middle of the line. I glanced at Bill, who seemed to have the same idea as me. We ran straight at the line, accelerating as only a mechanical otter can, then went down on all fours as we came to just outside of weapon range. As expected, the Quinlans aimed their stabby things downward at us. We leaped and sailed right over them. Quinlans can jump, of course, but not like this. In Quinlan terms, this wasn't quite like doing a pole vault without the pole, but it would definitely be a record-breaking high jump, and long jump, and sprint. We hit the ground just as Garfield and Bridget came around the ends of the line, having straight-armed their opponents as they stopped to look up. They dropped to all fours. Our afterburners cut in, and we disappeared down the street faster than they could possibly keep up with. A couple of pings off nearby walls led me to believe that at least one of them was now shooting at us as well. There was a brief, astonished silence behind us, which was good. Then a bunch of shouted warnings, which was bad. They weren't shouting at each other. This was shouting directed at someone far away. I had a bad feeling we weren't done. Detour guys, the direct route is booby-trapped or staked out or something. 3 acts. No one was sparing energy for speeches. We made an abrupt left at the next intersection, still setting a pace that would make a Quinlan Olympian quit in despair, assuming they had Olympics. More shouts. We'd piss them off, at least. To the left, up there, Bill said. I looked in the indicated direction. Not bad. A 3-story building with a flat roof and a reasonable climbing route, if you're into parkour. It would be fair to say that Quinlans are not climbers, and it would not occur to them that we might climb drain pipes and hop roofs. Bill led, we followed. Mechanical muscles and computer reflexes ensured no oopsies, and in seconds we were lying flat on top of a roof. There was a short barrier wall around the edges, more likely for aesthetics, as I couldn't see it being of any practical benefit. I opened my mouth, spit out a roamer, and set it on top of the wall. The others did the same, and in moments, we had 4 video windows hanging in our heads-up displays while we lay out of sight. Our pursuers came into view in a ragtag mob. They had clearly not planned for this eventuality. Some were checking doors and alleys, others were running back and forth on all fours. I could see 5 tranq guns being carried in plain view. Then one of the group called out, and the others gathered around her. I tagged her as a probable leader and made sure I got a close-up image. The group had a conversation that we couldn't make out, or maybe argument would be a better term. There was a lot of arm-waving and interrupting, and one attempted bite. But eventually they settled on a plan. A couple of Quinlans took up positions in the shadows where they could keep an eye on the street, while the rest marched off the way they'd come. "Looks like we're going to be here a while," Bill noted. "I need a coffee," I added. Leaving the Manny's AMIs on sentry, we all popped into my VR and grabbed our favorite seating. I pulled up the 4 video windows from our surveillance roamers and put them on the wall. Bill leaned forward and made a point of making eye contact with each of us. "I guess the first question we need to deal with is how they knew we were coming." That's got some assumptions in there. "Reasonable ones. We didn't do anything to attract attention in Elbow, like peeking into a cart." Bridget gave me the sideways eye. "One friggin' mistake." "Good point, though. This had the smell of setup right from when we asked." Garfield stopped abruptly and stared into space, his eyes growing slowly wider. "What?" "What?" We all knew that facial expression. It was the light bulb look. Instead of answering, Garfield pulled up another video showing our encounter with the helpful citizen who had given us directions. He paused the video, then pulled up another video from our subsequent encounter. He fast-forwarded a bit, then paused that video and placed them side by side. Sure enough, the helpful giver of directions was also one of our ambushers. "Well, that pretty much settles it, if there was any doubt in the first place." Bill swept us with a glare. "They were watching for us. Us. Specifically, in a town we'd never been in. The general population doesn't have anything like telephone or radio, or telegraphs." Garfield popped up the report from Hugh. "They explicitly are pre-steam and pre-electricity." And Hugh confirmed that they didn't have any electronics in Galen, I added. "But there are ways to communicate over long distances that don't depend on those technologies." Garfield shrugged dismissively. "Pony Express, ship-based mail systems, semaphore telegraph towers like in Lest Darkness Fall. We've seen no signs of any of that." "Actually, they do have a river-based mail system, but it's kind of what you might call relaxed in its execution. News of us would reach Elbow in about 2 weeks, which means our erstwhile captors have some more immediate form of communications." The administrator? "It does seem to be the most likely explanation. But using locals?" "Who says they're locals?" Bill said, cutting into my discussion with Garfield. "I mean, they're Quinlans, obviously, but they might go home at the end of the workday to their underground, fully tech-enabled bunkers." "Ah, secret police, sort of." "Wait," Bridget said. "You don't think these are resistance? Why?" "Quick communications between cities," Bill replied. "Multiple tranq pistols." I nodded. "Well, it makes sense if you think about it. There's some kind of secret society with full technological assets that is either controlling or at least monitoring the general population. They're probably responsible for scatterings when people break some set of rules." "Wait, hold on. The people we took on in Galentown who were trying to kill Skeeve talked about scattering as something that someone else did to them. They couldn't be part of the administrator's group." Garfield held up his hands in emphatic negation. "Unless it was Skeeve or his contacts that tagged us, Bridget. Maybe they noticed us trying to grab Skeeve." "Nope, that doesn't make sense either. Skeeve was scattered twice, remember? He wouldn't know anyone in Galentown." I grimaced in frustration. Damn it. Are we running from Skeeve and company or from his attackers? And if the latter, does that mean there's more than one group? And do any of them represent the administrator? Well, one way or another, we attracted someone's attention. Bill drew a deep breath and leaned back, hands behind his head. If they have some kind of back-channel communications, then it doesn't matter. Either way, they're a step up from the common population. I sighed. We have a lot of theories, but not much in the way of answers. The question is, should we let them succeed? What? Are you insane? That's ridiculous. Not one of my more popular suggestions. I contemplated the shocked and outraged expressions. It's just a thought, guys. And I guess it's always available if we get desperate, but it would presumably get us in touch with someone, one way or another. We'll keep it in mind, Bob, Bill said. But I think we'd have to be pretty desperate. It's an all-or-nothing action, and if we've guessed wrong, it would send us back to square one. Even worse than square one, I think, since the administrator would then know exactly what they are dealing with. I nodded, feeling obscurely disappointed, although whether that was with myself for the suggestion or my friend's reaction to it, I couldn't say. It was now very early the next morning, and the street surveillance had given up and gone home, or wherever, so we'd gone back to our mannies. The first order of business was getting down off the roof. I didn't want to go the same way we came up because it was always possible someone was still watching from a less obvious location, but a quick check around the periphery of the building made it clear that the route we'd taken was the only simple one, so it was that or go through the building. Fortunately, there was an entrance, a horizontal hatch which likely opened directly into the top floor. Unfortunately, it appeared to be secured from the inside. But we had roamers. I spit out a couple of 2mm models and sent them down between the cracks in the structure. It took them only seconds to discover the problem. A simple sliding latch. Unfortunately, moving that was beyond the strength capabilities of that particular model, even if we all unloaded our entire complement. Can we cut the latch off? Bill asked. I guess we'll have to, I replied. But let's make it quick. Everyone spit up fleas. We sent in a total of 20 of the little guys, miniature lightsabers primed and ready. 10 seconds of battling the dark side, and the latch released with a thud sound. I pulled up the hatch, and we carefully climbed down the very steep stairs. The building had the look of an apartment complex, long halls with numbered doors spaced evenly. A stairway was situated near the center of the building. No elevators, of course. The stairs creaked loudly enough to wake the dead in the next town, and we were all cringing with every step. When we got to the main floor, Bridget glanced around and pointed. Back door. Without waiting for agreement, she headed that way. The door led out to an alleyway, not particularly odious as alleys went, but quite gloomy due to the tall buildings on all sides. We paused to take stock. Are we just going to bail again? Bill asked. A good question, I replied. It might not actually be a terrible tactic to stay overnight and go to the library in the morning. I'd think they'd be expecting us to head downstream first thing. They might even have set up at the river to watch for us. Or we could cross over to the next river and head back upstream, double back, Garfield suggested. Maybe communications between rivers is less dependable or slower. Or, Bridget added, head downstream underwater and skip a couple of towns. What about taking a tributary? Bill said. We turned to him in surprise. The population isn't all concentrated along the main waterway. There are lots of tributaries and branches along the way, and there's usually a small town or village or two on them. Unlikely to have a good-sized library, Bill. That's what we're looking for. Yes, but also less likely to have goons looking for us. At least I hope so. All right, vote. I queued up a voting app. 2 milliseconds later, the results were in. 1 vote for each of 4 alternatives. Let's sigh. Well, looks like it's rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock again. The elimination rounds lasted a few extra milliseconds, but it soon transpired that we would be, by executive decision, going farther downriver. Okay, fine, but we can't just float down. That's asking for trouble. Agreed, Bill. Like Bridget said, we'll stay underwater and put some serious speed on. That will hopefully throw them off. This business of sneaking to the shore was getting really old. The vegetation was thick, and I didn't care how aquatic Quinlan's were. I didn't like swampy, squishy ground. But finally we were in the water. We went under immediately and stayed a good 20 to 30 feet below for hours, driving west as hard as our manis would allow. We still hadn't done that maintenance break, and I was a bit concerned about breakdowns, but the manis were well constructed and didn't give us trouble. This marathon swim would take us through one of the segment ends. We all agreed that this was a good thing and that it would be very interesting. Whether it would put us beyond the reach of our pursuers was up in the air. When we were close to the mountain, we all surfaced and formed a raft. We knew, generally speaking, what to expect. The river narrowed and consolidated as it approached the segment boundary until only 4 branches of it flowed through the mountains in straights wide enough to take the total river flow without forming rapids. The mountains themselves were impressive. They rose abruptly out of the shell with very little lead-up, only a mile or two of foothills, turning into a slope of 70 degrees easily. Looking at them, I decided that even that pitch was a concession to the engineering requirements of holding back the atmosphere, if and when. And they seemed to go up. Forever.
Are you sure this is intended to be closed off?
Bridget said, staring at the spectacle. We have scans, Bill replied. Not a ton of detail, but essentially the middle 100 yards or so of the segment boundary is a diaphragm, similar to a camera shutter. I think if it was activated, it would close off the segment right to the central cylinder. And you can see 2 sets of guy wires or pylons or stays of some kind attached to the central cylinder, if you engage telescopic vision. 1 set on either side of the central line of the mountains. The diaphragms would serve 2 purposes, Garfield added. 1, to allow segments of the topopolis to be pressurized during construction while adding new segments, and 2, as a safety mechanism in case of catastrophic blowout. Where would the river go, though? I asked. We already have 2 rivers going in each direction. Just divert all the water to the next river.
Wow.
Bridget shook her head in awe.
Are we sure we're more technologically advanced than these people?
Not really, no. We just have some tech that they don't. But remember, Bridget, and we said this back when we were starting out on this quest, this whole thing is just scale. Everything we see humans could do if they had the will, and a sufficiently long view to make them stick to it for however long it took. Bridget was silent for a moment.
I wonder if the Quinlans got their motivation from being certain that they'd kill themselves off soon.
Hair-trigger tempers plus advancing weapons technology. Not a stretch, as a working theory. During this discussion, we drifted into the actual strait. This section of the Arcadia River was perhaps 2 miles wide, which led me to believe that the river must be quite shallow through the segment itself. Otherwise, 4 straits wouldn't be able to handle the flow. In any case, the current had certainly picked up, as had the wind. Ships attempting to sail upriver would have a demanding and extended voyage. The mountains rose straight up out of the water on either side of us with no concession for any kind of usable shoreline. I thought I could see what might be a road or path along the nearer bank, but I couldn't resolve it enough, even at maximum magnification, to be sure. It was an impressive, if short, ride. Within minutes, we'd been spit out on the downstream side of the mountains, and the river immediately started to split off into tributaries. We also discovered something new. It was full night on this side of the mountains. I gazed up at the stars. We didn't time warp, did we? Interesting, Bill replied. It looks like the segments alternate day and night cycles. Makes sense, only half the segments would be drawing power for sunlight at any time. Or this segment has a burned-out bulb, Garfield added. Sure, or that, Bill said, rolling his eyes. Another 3 hours of floating brought us to a largish city, just as morning was breaking. Several sets of docks crowded with rivercraft hinted at a thriving industry. The city was close to a couple of tributaries, and it was likely that there were other settlements in those directions. This would be an excellent place to look for information and possibly make contact with a useful group. if we could figure out how not to get stabbed and shot during the introductions. We decided to improve our chances by entering the town individually. Group of Sabbatarians, one female, was a pretty good filter if they were watching arrivals. Hopefully they didn't have photorealistic wood carvings or something. The first person into town, Bill, set himself up to